Any other questions about national?
And then I'm going to
I have a question about my certificate.
After the meeting.
Doctor says he hasn't signed it. I'm afraid it's not really valid.
After the meeting. Okay. All right. So we want to thank Murray for coming today. I'm going to go ahead and hand over the floor. You'll do a personal introduction of all your.
Yeah.
Like part of his talk is kind of his introduction of where he's been and what he's done. So his credentials. So I don't want to steal his thunder. So, but thank you so much, and you can go ahead and get started.
Oh, thank you. Going more the motivational route, ergonomic career paths, and motivational talk. It'll be a combination of some ergo things I'm working on, as well as kind of give you this my story of how I got started in my career and the path I took, and maybe the why and things that happened to me and so forth. Okay, I'm Murray Gibson. I've got my bachelor's and master's here from Auburn in the early 90s. I'm a licensed professional engineer and a certified professional ergonomist. And I started out in industry, which I would advise. How many of you were looking to be in safety or ergonomics for your career? Some of the, okay. But yeah, I know what it feels like though. I was kind of at the point, I had an undergrad industrial engineering degree, and at that time the job market was really tough. And then I found out I could keep going to school and they would pay for it. And I had taken Dr. Thomas's course in ergonomics, and I really liked it. And I thought, wow, maybe I should give myself a chance to learn about something I really like instead of just things I can make myself do. So there's something out there all of us like to do. But I think it's important that you figure out what that is. A little about Saturn Ergonomics. Do you know where the, Tavern on the Tracks is? It's really right next to it. It's right next to the railroad tracks in this building. Upstairs and to the right, it's where Mitchum intersects into North College. But I'm research grounded in application. When I started doing my own consulting, I wanted to learn more about, I wanted to develop new technologies, and that led me into first reading research papers and finding out what was known about ergonomics. I realized all the time I was in industry, we kind of poo-hooed sometimes the academics or the research, and it's all about the application. But to really learn about any subject, you have to dig into the research, because the book is just kind of the outline, and they really don't have room in the book unless it's a very specialized book to go into any depth in much of anything. But anyway, I'm a PhD student and also operate my business here in Auburn. My mission statement is innovation, revolutionizing the application of ergonomics. And the longer I'm into consulting, I realize, wow, that's a pretty bold path to take. I didn't just say, I'm just doing consulting work or whatever, which when I look at my career, earlier career in consulting, most of what I did is take consultants pretty much take known technologies and apply them. So you're just trying to get more customers and more projects. But I always had an urge I never was really satisfied with the tools that we were using. And I thought they could be better. And I remember I used to sit sometimes in the airport. That's the joys of a job that requires a lot of travel. Sometimes you'll spend hours in airports. I remember I would go to scribbling and wanting to come up with some kind of model, and realize I really didn't know enough I had the impetus to do it, but I didn't really know enough to develop much of a model. I still have some of those early notes though, but you can find more of it. The website has more information about Saturn Ergonomics and just general information about the company and so forth. But I do, I'm develop technologies, specifically developing software or app technologies, and also I do consulting projects. But my perspective on innovation, to start with, I started out as a plant level ergonomic engineer, and I think that's, looking back, I went from being almost like no job offers to all of a sudden, within a week, it was multiple job offers, and they were in industrial engineering, and I'm not sure what it would equate to now, but it would be like making, say, $90,000 or so in today's dollars. but I took a job that was paid $10 an hour to be a plant level ergonomic engineer, but I was getting to work in something that I wanted to be in, and also I got a chance to implement a plant level ergonomic program. So even though no experience, I realized now I got to go in and do it firsthand, and there was value in that. Even though I didn't know what to do, I was in a position to learn about it. And it worked out pretty well there. It was a small manufacturing plant in Elberton, Georgia, and they had a position for corporate ergonomists that opened up. And so I got that position. And so then I was doing ergonomics, I think it was 13, 14 plants, most of them in the southeast. So I would travel around to the plants and kind of implement the same type of ergonomics process and initiatives that I had applied myself. And so it kind of got me used to going into different organizations and different processes and different people and so forth. And I kind of liked that. And we had some consultants that worked for us, and I kind of liked. I thought, well, gee, I want to give that a try. Even though I really don't like to travel, that's probably a bad choice, isn't it? Where you probably spend 2 out of 3 weeks traveling, or most of the weeks traveling. But anyway, I started looking into. I wanted to work for the very best, and I was looked at a position or two, but Dave Alexander here in Auburn, Alabama, is why I came back, because in my mind, at that time, Dave was the kind of the leading edge of innovation and thought leadership in ergonomics, and so I wanted to learn from him, and I came back to Auburn, but anyway, my years consulting, I worked with Auburn engineers for 3 years, and then I worked for Aon. I went to a much larger company where we had. One time we had like 7 or 8 CPEs. It was a really large group. But during those years, I applied ergonomics at scale. So you're going to a lot of different industries. Like with Torrington, they made bearings. But when I was with Aon, I went into, you never know what you would go into. Steel mill, could be riding in a milk truck at 3:30 in the morning, all kinds of stuff. So I applied ergonomics at scale and got to see a lot of things. And looking back, there was a period, I think you can stay in a job too long. And I there was a period of time, probably a decade. It's sad when I look back, but I was kind of doing the same thing. And I was, I think it was 13 or 14 years, I was either number 1 or number 2 in revenue with a group of around 30. The largest, it had 30 people in safety and ergonomics. So I was getting it done, but I didn't necessarily lead to promotions or making a whole lot of money or anything. But it got to where you kind of doing the same thing over and over, and I kind of got bored, and I wanted to do something different. And it's really difficult to leave your job when you've been in one that long. You're making. It was kind of easy for me, and but to decide, hey, I'm going to quit this, because you can see the path. If you just stay in there and your 401k and everything, you'll be fine at retirement if you start investing early. But you start to do things like, I'm going to start my own business. That's really throws a uncertainty in there. You really don't know how it's going to turn out. Yeah. And I'll tell you, it's a lot more difficult than people would think. But anyway, I sort of had a desire to make a difference and develop technologies that were more impactful for ergonomics. But this is kind of, there's me in my office when I was a corporate ergonomist, and like I said, you spend a lot of time in airports, airplanes, rental cars, all kinds of things, and spent many an hour watching jobs. You just see people performing work just over and over. And I say, I'm working. It looks like I'm just watching, but I'm actually thinking, thinking of solutions and things. But innovation, I think one is you need to have a desire to develop a solution. And all of us are faced with problems, things that we don't necessarily work particularly well, like a lot of the ergonomic analysis tools I used for years. I never was impressed with most of them. I was like, half the time when I was training, especially engineers, I felt like I was winging it. Can they tell that I'm winging it? And I really don't know how to fit everything into this single task tool either. But I'd have to give them the best that I could. and another thing with innovation is persisting beyond what most people would consider reasonable. Because sometimes you just have people have ideas, but in particular, the model I developed, the RCRA model, multitask analysis type model, it didn't come easy, and I probably spent over a few weeks, probably 80, 90 hours, and I was looked at textbooks and did like doodling, and I really didn't know. I was trying to innovate and come up with something new. And I was about to give up, and I looked down, and it was one of the last 2 or 3 papers that I probably had about 20 research papers. That's not much of a library. They were hard copy. But one of the last ones was by Dr. Jim Potvin, his MAE equation. And when I saw that equation, I said, it's in there. I knew that I could develop the model with that model. But anyway, I think you have to persist sometimes when things, even if you're starting a business, when it looks bleak and you're not making any headway. I mean, you can have dry spells. That's the thing about consulting is you can have, like before COVID happened, I had 8 proposals. Guess how many I had after the 2 weeks to flatten the curve? Had 0. So, there are times when it looks like it'd be much easier to work for the man, and it would be. But especially to innovate or do your own business, you have to have belief in yourself, and I think a vision of where you want to go to. And I don't think sometimes people randomly stumble upon some idea, but I think you have to have kind of a destination in mind. And I kind of inherently knew that I wanted to develop some kind of calculator to model forces. I was always kind of intrigued by forces and what was acceptable or unacceptable given the frequencies and or durations and things like that. And early in 2015, you remember this, Dr. Sessick, when Dr. Thomas invited me and I came over here and I shared with y'all a concept for a model, or for a calculator. I knew what I wanted it to do, but I didn't necessarily have a model behind it. But even this concept of percentage of males and females that can apply for us, that's something that I kind of forgotten, but ultimately it had that in there as well. So we kind of had the initial calculator pretty much resembled, even though it doesn't look like that, that's kind of what it does. And I even had some notes I had made for that visit. When you're first starting out, you don't have many visits, and I get to go to Auburn University and talk with the faculty. I'd not really had much interaction for years with the university. But some of those initial notes have a practical force calculation tool for the practitioner, and I wanted to publish a research paper. And now looking back, that was kind of comical. I had not published any research paper. I'd read several. And then I knew like work, rest models and related research, so some kind of recovery. And also I wanted, let me see. Anyway, that's enough about that. But how kind of the recommended cumulative recovery allowance I was telling about, I saw that paper and I knew the answer was in there. But muscle fatigue, and I was kind of under the notion I wanted to develop a fatigue evaluation model. So I looked at whole body fatigue, and that's kind of complicated. There's a whole lot of data from the research 80s, 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, or whatever. But I started, muscle fatigue seemed more along the lines of what I was looking at. But basically when people apply force, as you fatigue, it reduces the magnitude of the force you can apply. You can't apply as much force. It also impacts the speed. You're slower, and also negatively impacts accuracy. And I ran across something, it was over vacation, I was reading, have any of you read The Principles of Scientific Management or heard of Frederick Taylor? He was, all I remember from the Tech and Civ classes, he was remembered for being a bigot and saying comments about an Irishman or something like that. But he was actually a performance ergonomist. And I was intrigued, one of the things he wanted the very specific language he uses, it was talking about after a muscle applies a force, how to determine how much recovery time is needed so that productivity doesn't decline over the course of the workday. Okay, so the concept of, so you have, for every force there's a requisite recovery time. You have a duration, like T0 to T1, and you have a magnitude, and there's a recovery time after that. Okay, now say we keep the duration the same, but we increase the magnitude, we're going to have more recovery time. Or we keep the magnitude the same and we increase the duration, we're going to have more recovery time. So those are really the things I was playing with, is magnitude and the duration, and there has to be some way to calculate that. And Sue Rogers was somewhat close. She was using a model, Romert's fatigue evaluation models back in the 70s, but they were fatigue taken to exhaustion, so they really don't quite work well to answer what I was trying to answer. But taking that knowledge, and then when I saw Dr. Poppins' equation, I was like, it's in there. I know it's in there. It's a really, really simple equation. 1 minus duty cycle to the 0.24 power. So if you know the duty cycle, you can calculate the percentage of maximum strength that's acceptable for somebody to apply. I'm going to give you a crash course in duty cycle. It's the percentage of time you're applying force. So we have a 60-second cycle. If you're applying force 22% of the cycle, the other 78%, the muscle has a chance for recovery. And it can be, this is an example of calculating duty cycle. We have 2 1-second forces and a 2-second force. These are all the same magnitude. So 4 seconds out of 10, we're applying force. The duty cycle is 0.4. You can have equivalent duty cycles. That's what's neat. Kind of one of the things, Dr. Poppins' MAE equation, even though it did not work with different magnitudes of forces, it worked with different durations. And they did some research it really doesn't matter for most shortish cycles, say like less than 2 minutes or whatever, if they're all concentrated close together or if they're spread out. If we know that duty cycle, we can get. So here, if the duty cycle is 0.4, we plug that into the equation, or you can see just going up the graph, and you can apply, at 40% duty cycle, you can apply 20% of your maximum strength. So if my maximum strength was 100, I can apply 20 pounds given that scenario, and dispersed however I want to in the duration of my cycle. But that equation, it took about a page and a half, and I had a few missteps, but looking back, I was showing it to Dr. Sesek, I believe it was last year, and when I looked at it in hindsight, I was like, wow, that was more complicated than I kind of remember, because it required like a substitution, and then at one point I had to combine something or do another substitution, so it wasn't that straightforward. But basically, you don't really need to know all the variables, but if you know the magnitude of a force, the frequency, and the duration, and then you can account for posture, you can calculate a recovery time. And here's an example of a force time profile. Say we have a 60-second work cycle, and we have 8 forces. We have 4 little forces and 4 big forces, and they're all 3/4 of a second duration. And this shows so how would we calculate? So we've got 60 seconds, kind of the space between those bars is your in-task recovery or in-cycle recovery. So we take the 60 seconds and we subtract the time we're applying force, which amounts to 6 seconds. We're left with 54 seconds in that cycle that the muscle could recover. And you could, to credit Bob with this visual model, Dr. Potvin and I have been trying to explain it to people for 6 years, and Bob came up with the best way to visually see it that I've seen. But say we have a 60-second cycle, force is applied for 6 seconds, and you see you have 54 seconds to recover. Well, how do we know if that in-cycle recovery is sufficient? I said if you can calculate the recovery time needed for each force, then we can take that in-cycle recovery, and if our recovery time, the model recovery is less than that, we're in good shape. But if it's more than that, we're going to fatigue. So anyway, there's that again. So you can plug it into that equation, the 4 big forces and the 4 little forces, and it winds up you need about the little forces, 10% of your maximum strength requires less than 2 seconds of recovery time. So little forces you can do a lot of little forces. But the big forces, 2/3 of your maximum strength. Say if whatever your maximum bench press is, imagine doing 4 of those. It's going to take a little time to recover from it did 2/3 of that, a little time to recover. It takes about 270 seconds to recover from those 4 big forces. So we look at this visual model, we see the force application time, that consumes 6 seconds. 1 seconds is needed to recover from those little forces, and we have about 52 seconds remaining, and we can say, whoa, we just blew out that value. We don't have near the recovery time that we need. We needed 5 times more than we had. So what the ratio is a model recovery time divided by the in-cycle recovery. So it's 5.0. And you would interpret that like this. If it's less than 1, you're green, you're in good shape. If it's more than 1, you don't have enough recovery. So you color code it as such. Multitask analysis. This is something that's starting to, I guess you hear more and more about. I've seen there's recently some papers about multitask analysis. There was a lit review, and in some papers the researchers note that the difference between single task and multitask analysis. There's one in particular, Washington State Department of Labor, and they basically said, well, we have the means to do this. He said, like the RCRA, you can do this multitask analysis. Why don't we use that? but so it's something you start to hear a little bit more about it. If you look at the color coding, these are the models that we've used. These models I used when I worked in industry and consulting. Some of them have been around a long time, 20, 30 years old, the models are. And I used a few of these, a subset of these for years. But those are the ones with the black dots. And notice the colored dots, the blue and the red, are the multitask models. What do you notice about those? They're more recent. Yeah, they're much more recent. So you see a lot of there's more focus on multitask models. And this is Bob and I presented at Applied Ergonomics Conference. Now, one thing, we developed a lot of ideas. A lot of these were pre-COVID.
Would you mind explaining to our new 30-20 students what the difference between a single versus a multitask is?
I'll show it in just a minute. I'll show a good example of that. But Bob and I did a presentation, and it's gotten. I mean, when I looked down in that room, I was like, wow, I can't believe some of these people are actually here, because I'm used to presenting on Thursday afternoon. Most of the people have already gone home. But it's basically like Allison Stevens. She's probably one of my ergo heroes. To have people like her and some of the General Motors ergonomists and some of those folks, like, wow, some people are starting to take note. And I did a newsletter, and this is the first newsletter. You might want to subscribe. Wink, wink. Not a wink, wink, or whatever. But it's a Saturn Ergonomics on LinkedIn. And you can subscribe to the newsletter, and every week I'm going to give you an innovation update. But I believe it was the first 2 days, it was like a subscriber every 10 or 11 minutes. Yeah. And then also next week, Dr. Sessick and I go through the University of Waterloo. We're going to Ontario to present some of these technologies and some cool stuff Dr. Sessick is doing on interpretation of that's another thing that's really important, how we interpret the risk levels. So being able to do multitask models and interpret the risk levels better. I've been noticed on Google the other day, out of curiosity, and a lot of things come up for multitask analysis. And I think it was it's not quite as content rich as this is. I cut a few things out, but I think it was 4 of the first top 12 were things we published here at Auburn, collaborations, AJ and Bob and I. 2 book chapters, and then there was a presentation or 2. The characteristics of effective ergonomic assessment tools, that was more Bob and Dr. Sessick. But how much error is acceptable? If I were asking you for any model, how much error would be acceptable? We're predicting an injury risk level.
5%.
5%?
0.
0? How many of you think 50% would be okay? 100%?
Definitely not
What about 2,000%? I looked at a real job. Anyway, I'll show you some of the. I think it can be as high as that, though. We're just learning about this. But basically, that was Nate's question about a single task job. That's where somebody does the same thing. I think you get kind of bored doing that.
What is this?
It's a single task job where you're doing the same thing over and over. And most of the tools the older tools we use as single task models, they tell you this it's designed for a single or monotask job. You're doing the same thing over and over. They don't handle when you do a variety of things like forces of different magnitude or different duration. It has to be the same thing, like snip, snip.
Murray, what was that?
This?
It looks like some extruded, like, rendering product. Maybe it's some biscuit dough or something, but
Bobbit plantain cutter or something. I don't know.
And you guys got like whatever size your heart desires? Like, you just buy it all, each different size, doesn't matter?
What now?
You can just pack them in different sizes, doesn't
Yeah,
matter
it's
the
not
size.
uniform.
You do whatever your heart desires.
It's something I saw on Instagram. I was looking for repetitive job. There's some better ones probably.
I mean, it's not well done.
But anyway, the models that we've used, the single task models, expect this, the same thing every time, same duration for the force, same magnitude. But when we get out in the real world, we see more things like this, different levels of force. Maybe I turn this screw, it requires this level of torque. Maybe this other screw requires 4 or 5 times that. The durations change. So how do we model things when they're different? And the papers always say you take the average or you take the worst case. Okay? Going back to the example, the 4 big forces and 4 little ones, if we take the average, notice this is what we started with. This is what we're doing. That's what's real. But when we say they're all the average, then, we're kind of, it's literally what it is. It's an average. And it's 38% of the max. Instead of 10%, 4 being 10%, 4 being 66%, it's all 8 are 38%. Now, the worst case, we say, okay, we're going to assume they're all 2/3 of your maximum strength. Okay? But when you calculate the recovery time using the RCR equation, notice for multitask, we calculated we needed 271 seconds. What do you notice about the single task when we averaged it? It's a lot less than that. It said we only needed 38 seconds. When we used the worst case, we overstated it substantially, double what it should be. And all of this stuff, I was going to tell you about kind of randomly inject how one idea you can get in your head. It can result in something you do down the road. All this stuff stems from, a lot of this stuff from in 2015, I saw one slide of Dr. Sessik's that said the average understates the risk and the worst case overstates it. And so, it's like a year or two ago, I got thinking, okay, how can we actually quantify that? So, and you can run a multitask model, single task, by just doing an input of an average of the worst case, but you can't run a single task model multitask. But now that we have multitask models, we can kind of get an idea of what we're losing. And notice the legend that less than 1 is desirable, green. But notice we needed 5 times more recovery time than we had. When we used the average input, it said the job was okay. Now imagine if you were out in a plant, an engineer or supervisor, and we say this job's okay, and it's significantly worse than that. Or with the worst case, we say it's double, what the risk level or whatever, or what it should be. So you could just see all kinds of erroneous decisions simply due to that average. And the reason is we're finding that the nonlinear relationship between force is one of the primary causes. Or anything where you have model inputs and it's nonlinear, the high ones count more than the low ones. And there's several advantages of multitask analysis, improved accuracy, helps with solution development. What time do we have?
6:30, 6:35.
Okay. We're doing okay on time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Tell some about career tips. I think it's important to find something that interests you. Looking back at what I've done, I may not have always liked where I was, but I liked what I was doing. I enjoyed ergonomics and have never regretted that I've been in some capacity applying ergonomics my whole career. Two, tell you that education is easier earlier in your career. If you're contemplating to get a PhD or whether to get that master's or whatever, I would go ahead and get it all. If you're gonna, if it only takes a year or 2 years, it'd be a lot easier. It's really tough later in life. You don't have as much energy. You don't have as much time. See, Bob's smiling out here. But you have more. It's a lot easier when you're younger. Yeah, you wind up. You may be studying in the evenings, on weekends, and things that aren't very pleasant. And two, you only get one career, and make it yours, and do something that you want to do, not just what you could take maybe the field or whatever with the highest salary, but the thing is with that, if you're not any good at it or if you're not interested in it, you're probably not going to be one of the best. But if it's something that you're really interested in, you could potentially be one of the best in the field comparatively. So that's one thing. You only get one chance, and you reach a point of kind of you can't really change things. It's kind of like you go so far down a path. You're an accountant or whatever. That's what you do. It's hard to, if you do 30 years in accounting, you're probably not going to do something else. But I made a change really early in my career. My first job was in grad school. I was a co-op in the safety department, and I realized that compliance safety wasn't for me. It was so much of what now I know that some companies really do it for the right reasons and everything, but to a degree, they're just about all doing to be in compliance. And you hear it sounds good. Oh, that compliance is just the minimum level, and it is, and that's what a lot of companies are doing. And it's nice to do things beyond that. But I'll never forget, it was a man. He had to at least be in his 60s. Probably now I realize he's probably in his 40s. but at the time I thought he's old to be doing this. He was pushing on. It was a paper mill that I worked at. He was pushing on a pry bar with everything he had to remove logs that were jammed up in this big flume. And there was no safety regulation that really addressed that. And I did my master's project. I did a pretty extensive loss analysis, and there were very few things that I saw that directly tied into, we had this injury because we weren't in compliance on this regulation. You just don't see that. Things, almost like a lot of random things happen. But I would choose experience and growth over short-term money, because if you get the experience, you can always parlay that into something. Like if I wanted to be a corporate ergonomist or whatever, and if I had taken a job as an industrial engineer, it'd kind of be hard for me to get into that job as a corporate ergonomist. So whatever the level of the work is, as long as it's in a path at least where you want to go. And I'd say you don't want to stop learning or growing and look for new challenges. Like when I tell you about, I spent a decade probably doing the same thing over and over. Looking back, one of the things I became interested in was tournament poker. I needed something to have something new and stimulating to do, and I would travel around to different parts be in California and places and play in poker tournaments sometimes. Occasionally I stayed over the weekend to do that. But anyway, find something that if you're in something, you need new mental challenges and new things to learn. And life's too short to stay in a kind of a lame-o job or work for a bozo boss. There's a situation or two, one in particular, no, I would not accept that. But you wind up, you'd be surprised what people will put up with in industry. Well, this is their whole livelihood, that's their job. But you can have some people that are so unpleasant to work for, and the guy eventually got fired. But if I could go back, I wouldn't have taken a lot of the stuff we had to put up with. It was really abusive. And another thing is, don't compromise your integrity. And had one of my early bosses, I remember we had a situation, this was in ergonomics, where it really would have helped the client to have, it was something to do about the job rotation, and it would have helped them if we had said it was below a certain level. And my boss, he said, no, it is what it is. We're not going to misstate things. And I kind of took that and whether you're doing expert witness or whatever, you have to be honest and objective. And I have been in situations where you're expected to say, for instance, if somebody was expected to say that there wasn't sufficient evidence that a job caused an injury, when you really thought, oh, there really is, but people wind up peer pressure and other things. People will go along with it. They'll behind the scenes they'll talk about it, but when it comes down to really saying, hey, this is wrong, there's going to be very few people that will stand up and have your back. I mean, it won't happen, and you'll probably eventually run into some situation where whatever your company you work for or career or whatever your profession, you don't want to do something that's wrong, because you have trouble going to sleep at night. You're thinking about it, and that's wrong or whatever. So I reached a point. I said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I may have done it 2 or 3 times, but I'm not doing that anymore. I remember there was a time when I hit send on an email that I thought, well, that's my job or whatever. And I didn't realize that was probably job security. Then I was kind of stuck there. But anyway, that's kind of how many I have. 7 career tips. Whatever. Think I could write a book about that? Motivational book, maybe. But anyway, that's. Any questions?
What were you meaning when you said, when you hit send on the email that it was job security or not? Can you clarify that?
Yeah, I had kind of made a case for things I had been complaining about that we were doing that I didn't think was ethical or right. And I sent it to somebody high enough up, above a level or 2 above where I had been trying to get someone to listen to me.
Yep.
So, but if it's well written and documented, you reach a point though. There's, that's all I could do. I could just keep. You can have pressure put on you to do things that you don't really agree with, or if it's something that is not. I mean, if something's not right, and like somebody told you to cheat on an exam or something, that's wrong. But they could rationalize, oh, we're trying to improve the GPA. That's wrong. You'd say you wouldn't do that. But anyway.
So did you ever find yourself, did you ever find yourself like paralyzed to make a decision on your careers? Like, sometimes just figuring out what the next step is going to be, and, it can be really hard to decide. And what's a tip for trying to make, you've got some, help in your career, but to get past that paralysis, to make that jump into, like you said, if you're trying to choose between being an industrial engineer that pays a whole lot more and then take that $10 job, like what?
I would say go with your instinct, and you could do all the pros and cons and score it out and put a numerical. You can do that till the cows come home, but you kind of know what you need to do or you should be doing. You got to feel compelled to do something. And I remember when probably more so when I decided to leave my job as a corporate ergonomist to get into consulting, like as a low-level consultant, and then also leaving my job at Aon to start my own business. I was in turmoil for a few months there, just trying because I knew it's what I wanted to do, but it's especially after you've worked in a job for that long, it's just hard to pull the trigger. Right. And everybody talks about they're going to start their own business or something, but usually it's talk. It's hard to. There's a big difference between talking about it and doing it.
So I wanted to relate to the students that hadn't heard this. And there's a book called Procrastinate on Purpose, and it talks about taking time that you don't have to do something. And Murray mentioned spending 90 hours a week for several weeks to figure out this model, right? This RCR model that he was inspired by Jim Potvin. He presented it at a conference, was nervous about what he was presenting, and it turns out that Jim Potvin's in the audience.
Oh.
And then Murray sees this guy in the audience, right? And then he's kind of worried, like, oh God, I hope I didn't screw this up. Potvin comes up and says, I've been trying to figure out how to do what you just did for a long time. Let's write a paper. And they wrote a paper together. And I think the point here is there's a lot of sweat equity that goes into this. It's easy to say, oh yeah, Murray's got a business, he did this. But to quit a job, and by the way, his advice on going to school and getting it done, it's hard to quit a job and say goodbye to money and impoverish yourself again once you've tasted money, all right? And I did it on one level, but I know someone even dumber than me that is doing it now at age 56. And it's still not impossible.
I'm not that age, at least that's not me.
Yeah. We got a lot of people who are.
Close my business.
Yeah, so, but it you know, it still could be the right thing to do, and take a chance and do something and move a different direction and do what you want to do. And you know, we've talked a lot about this, and in fact, you know, when Murray came by, I'm just twisting his arm, you need to do a PhD. You're actually writing papers and doing these things. I think the idea of writing down a ridiculous goal, like he said, I wrote down, write a paper. Who am I to think you're gonna write a paper? But you did. And you were a PhD student when you did it, you know, or it was before, you know, that got started before this. But I think, you know, taking a chance and going after what you want to do, and I think that's what's really cool about this. You know, starting a business.
Somebody has to do it, and we all tend to defer to some expert. And I'm thinking back, I went to a conference, the first conference I went to, and they were talking, oh, well, you know, another decade of research, it's like we'll have all the answers. And they still didn't have the, you know, all the answers. Like, I'm going to try my hand at this. And as imperfect, you know, as it, or as little qualifications as I had or whatever, somehow, you know, I did come up with something somewhat significant anyway. But that's the thing, is believing that you're the one that can do that, not just somebody else. And the reality is, especially if you've been in the field and, you know, you've thought about it and probed at it longer than somebody else, you may be the best person to do that. Maybe not the best on paper.
I think the other thing that resonated with me is you mentioned, some Tom Duvall always says is, you know, some people have, you know, instead of 10 years of experience, 1 year of experience 10 times. And Murray said for about 10 years, he was really good at what he did. You were the best, you were the most productive, you wrote more and probably better reports than most people, but you were bored that you weren't pushing the envelope or learning new things, and you were...
They had more drawings. I think Bob likes to say over Murray at whatever. I had the best drawings too. So I had the quantity and the quality.
Now to do something creative and go beyond, you know, I think that's something I encourage people to do.
Yeah, and I used to want, especially when I worked with a larger group of consultants, I'd want to come up with new variants of tools and things, and it was like, oh, well, you know, what's your reference for that? Or, you know, it was all like you had to, it's like, I don't, you know, you don't always, it's just better, you know. You know, I know you need scientific evidence and stuff, but it's always, a lot of people have this attitude that you know, it has to be, you know, there has to be a t-test showing that this is, you know, sometimes things are just intuitively better, or in the application they're better. Anyway.
So in one of the slides, you showed the timeline of the different ergonomic tools that have been developed over the years. And I think on that slide, you also said that most of the multitask tools have only come about recently. So I'm just wondering, are the companies nowadays coming closer to accepting that multitask tools are better compared to single task? Are they able to accept that? Are they on board with that? Or
you kind of have the leading edge, what I call the leading edge practitioners that kind of, not necessarily younger, a lot of them tend to be younger guys, but they're more research savvy, but it's almost a state of some of these technologies, it's almost customized analysis. There's a lot of stuff you have to bring together to put it in that equation, and there are a lot of people that have been just doing, say, I would say, it's not value, but, you know, run-of-the-mill traditional ergonomics and tools, they don't really have maybe the savvy per se to feel confident using those tools. And so there's like Dr. Potvin's software that we saw that, and I'm working on some software. But I think that's going to be a key to make those multitask analysis easier. And then there's a lot we're just learning. I mean, it's relatively early. And there's questions like how do you segregate the forces? Or when I apply these models in consulting, it's like every project I learn, it seems like I learned something new about how to apply it and that I've just learned by doing. And it's going to take a while before, maybe it's, and then I think leaving this stuff with model error. I mean, I can't believe that I'm not aware of that being addressed anywhere. And to me, it seems so simple, but I guess there was really no way to make the single task model multitask. And so it's kind of eye-opening to see the levels of inaccuracy. Like you said, 5% inaccuracy. Well, I just showed you a little simple example where you had 100% inaccuracy. And I've seen down to over 1,000, 2,000%. And I'm curious as if you had a contest you could develop a scenario. What's the maximum you could calculate? But there's like a. But anyway, that's kind of getting off in the weeds there.
I think too, to answer Suhas's question is, unfortunately, there's a lot of old tools that just keep getting used and used again, and now we're taking high-tech stuff. It's like putting a scope, not on a gun, but on a slingshot. You've got some crude tool, but you've got some laser, and it doesn't do you any good. It doesn't make it any better, but it looks cool. Or we're using our phone to collect all the postures, and then we plug it in the friggin' ruler, right? And we get something that's garbage. So,
Yeah.
But
That's
I
just
think,
pretty colored.
yeah, but it's lots of colors.
And there's a complacency too. Well, these tools, some of these tools have been validated, extensively, and so there's kind of a comfort level. But
I think it's how you tell the story. Like, that you have an understanding about what the strengths and the disadvantages of each one of them and what you have done and how you can tell that story and how you sell it. I think that matters more, because I guess ruler has like a really good high value, tells you nothing, but you're gonna have my people who are gonna stick with it, like they depend on it. So.
And then there's creative ways that come up with to fit the work into a single task model. It's kind of to me, it almost seems if we can do it multitask, it'd just be easier than to come up with some convoluted way to like the higher force of this hand and the longer duration, or average this, and in the end, like what do you have? But Dr. Sessing and I have talked about ways to maybe take the single task models and upgrade some of them to make them where it more accurate, because you could do exponents and things, so the higher forces count more. But anyway, it's kind of relatively new, and there's not that many people. Suhas's original question: there aren't that many people applying the models. I think it was in the conference we went a couple weeks ago at AEC. Dr. Ladelfa asked how many people had used different models, and the fatigue failure had 4 or 5 hands. That's a room probably, I would say 25, 30 people. 4 or 5 hands for fatigue failure, 2 or 3 for RCRA, if that. So it's relatively new.
How well did your course time here prepare you for industry?
I think Dr. Thomas, one thing he stressed is being practical. That was it. That was his mantra, is being practical. And if you come in there with a scientific answer or whatever, it's got to be something that makes sense and is very practical. And then when I worked for Dave Alexander too, that was his mantra, is practical. I think maybe to a fault you can ignore the complexity. And now I'm kind of enjoying. I appreciate the practical. I did that for several years, but I appreciate things aren't always. It's a little bit more complicated than just putting a stack of pallets up onto the load. There's more nuance to it than that.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.